This story tells us about a man named Arthur, a mechanic whose life revolved around engines, grease, and the quiet rhythm of everyday work. He had always been fascinated by how machines worked. As a child, he would sit for hours in his father's small garage, watching the older man carefully dismantle engines, tighten bolts, and breathe life back into broken vehicles. Arthur never understood why most people saw machines as tools. To him, they were puzzles, each with its own personality, its own temperament, and its own story to tell. By the time he turned 25, Arthur had become the most trusted mechanic in his town. People from all over came to his modest workshop. Cars, motorcycles, trucks, nothing intimidated him. He had an almost uncanny ability to diagnose problems simply by listening to engines or observing the way a gear turned. His hands were steady, his mind precise, and his reputation solid. Yet Arthur was humble. He never boasted about his skills, even when neighbors marveled at his work. To him, fixing a machine was not an achievement, it was a duty. Arthur's days followed a predictable rhythm. Mornings were for tuning engines and repairing damaged parts. Afternoons often brought surprises. A car that refused to start, a motorcycle that had mysteriously stopped working, or a truck that had been in an accident. Evenings were quieter. He would clean his tools meticulously, sometimes sip a cup of strong coffee while thinking about the latest design he had seen or a new technique to improve his repairs. Life was simple, comforting, and secure. Then the war arrived. It began quietly at first. Rumors floated through the town like autumn leaves on the wind. Soldiers marched in neighboring villages. Whispers of mobilization reached Arthur's workshop, and he heard distant explosions that seemed impossible in a place so familiar. At first he tried to ignore it. War was something that happened elsewhere, in distant cities or foreign lands. It wasn't supposed to touch him, not here, not in the small town where engines roared and children laughed in the streets. But war has a way of breaking that illusion. One morning, a convoy of military trucks rumbled into town, their tires kicking up dust and dirt. Soldiers with weary faces and hurried movements entered his workshop asking for repairs. Their vehicles had been damaged on the outskirts, and they needed Arthur's expertise to get them moving again. At first he hesitated. He had never worked on military machinery, tanks, armored trucks, heavy artillery vehicles. They were far more complex than the engines he was used to repairing. And yet he could not refuse. Something stirred in him, a sense of responsibility that went beyond personal safety or the comfort of routine. Arthur began working on the military engines, and he found himself enthralled once more. Each tank or truck was like a puzzle, a machine that demanded complete attention. He spent hours bending over engines, checking connections, oil systems and gears, often ignoring the shouts of soldiers or the distant sounds of bombardments in neighboring towns. He realized that his life as a mechanic had prepared him for this. The patience, the attention to detail, and the steady hands, all of it mattered now more than ever. At night, he would return home to his small apartment above the workshop. The streets, once familiar and comforting, now carried the tension of uncertainty. Sirens, gunfire in the distance, and hurried footsteps replaced the usual laughter of neighbors and the hum of engines. Arthur found sleep elusive. His mind wandered to the machines he had fixed that day, the soldiers who had depended on him, and the unimaginable things the war would demand tomorrow. Yet, despite the fear and chaos, he felt an odd clarity. He understood his role. He was not a soldier, but he was essential. The machines he repaired were lifelines for the men who risked everything. The days blurred together. Arthur worked tirelessly, sometimes through the night, driven by a sense of duty that eclipsed exhaustion. His hands were scratched and scarred, his clothes smeared with oil and soot, but his mind remained sharp. He developed a reputation among the soldiers as someone who could bring the most broken machinery back to life, even under impossible conditions. And slowly, Arthur began to realize something profound. In a war where bullets and explosions dominated, his quiet skill, his understanding of engines, might save more lives than a single rifle. Yet Arthur could not foresee what lay ahead. The real test was not just the machines. It was the war itself, the chaos, the fear, and the moment when the work of his hands would decide the fate of men, lives, and battles. He would soon learn that war demanded more than mechanical skill. It demanded courage, quick thinking, and the ability to make impossible decisions in a heartbeat. And in the end, Arthur would discover that being a mechanic in a world at war meant fixing more than just machines. Arthur had never thought of himself as brave. Courage was for soldiers, for men and women trained to face death and chaos head on. He was a mechanic, a man of gears, pistons, and oil stains. Yet the war had a way of redefining what bravery meant, and Arthur would learn that it wasn't always about charging into a firefight. It was about making decisions that could mean life or death for dozens of people. The first battle came unexpectedly. A small convoy of tanks and armored trucks had been sent to secure a strategic bridge outside the town. Arthur was called along, not as a fighter, but as the person who could keep the vehicles running. The soldiers joked at first, teasing him about wearing a helmet and carrying a toolbox instead of a gun, but Arthur ignored them. He knew that his work would be as important as their bullets, perhaps even more so. When the convoy reached the bridge, chaos erupted. Enemy fire rained down from the hills. The lead tank hit a hidden explosive trap, and its engine seized. Smoke filled the air, and men scrambled to escape the burning vehicle. Arthur ran forward without hesitation, toolkit in hand, his mind focused entirely on the engine. He felt the heat from the fire, heard the shouts of soldiers, and saw the chaos around him. But all that mattered was the tank before him. He worked quickly, hands moving over metal and wires, feeling for faults and damage as if the machine itself were speaking to him. Minutes stretched like hours. Shells exploded around him, throwing dirt and shrapnel, but Arthur remained calm. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with oil, grime, and fear, yet he didn't stop. The engine groaned, coughed, and then miraculously roared back to life. The tank lurched forward just as another blast tore the earth behind it. The soldiers cheered, some in disbelief, some with relief. Arthur didn't think about their praise. He only knew that the tank, and the men it carried, were alive because he had done his job. For the first time, he understood the true weight of his work. Fixing an engine was no longer a quiet act in a small town. It was a matter of survival. Each bolt he tightened, each gear he aligned, could save lives in ways he had never imagined. After the battle, Arthur felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The adrenaline faded, leaving him staring at his blackened hands, wondering how he had remained so calm amid the chaos. Soldiers clapped him on the back, called him a hero, and even offered him cigarettes. But Arthur simply shook his head. He wasn't a hero. He was a mechanic, doing what he had always done. Only now the stakes were unimaginably higher. The news of his work spread quickly among the troops. Officers began requesting his presence at other strategic points, asking him to assess damaged vehicles, rebuild engines from debris, and improvise solutions that seemed impossible. Arthur found himself moving from one battlefield to another, each time confronted with the delicate balance between life and machinery. His days became longer, the nights shorter, and his dreams haunted by the constant hum of engines and distant explosions. Despite the horrors around him, Arthur discovered a quiet satisfaction. Machines, unlike soldiers, did not panic, did not betray, and did not falter under pressure. They responded to skill, patience, and understanding, and Arthur had all three in abundance. The more he worked, the more he realized that war was not only about combat, it was about problem-solving under pressure, improvisation, and the small acts of dedication that kept people alive. Yet Arthur also felt the shadow of fear. One wrong calculation, one missed connection, and a tank could fail at the worst possible moment. He had seen men trapped in burning vehicles, had heard the screams of those who could not escape, and knew that every engine he repaired carried a silent responsibility. It wasn't just about machines, it was about human lives. Each repair became a moral test, each engine a lifeline that he could not afford to fail. By the end of the first battle, Arthur had become more than a mechanic to the soldiers. He had become a symbol of hope, a quiet force they could rely on even when everything else fell apart. Yet he remained humble, insisting that he was only doing his job. Little did he know the true test was still ahead, a test that would demand ingenuity, courage, and resilience beyond anything he had ever faced. After the first battle, Arthur's reputation spread quickly through the ranks. Soldiers began to call him the Lifeline, though he never sought such titles. To him it was simply work. Fixing machines was what he knew how to do. But in war, knowing how to do something could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The next assignment took him to a supply route that had been cut off by enemy artillery. Armored trucks laden with ammunition and medical supplies were stranded, engines dead or crippled from constant shelling. Arthur arrived to a scene that looked like a graveyard. Burnt-out vehicles, twisted metal, and soldiers crouched behind makeshift cover, exchanging fire with an unseen enemy. Arthur didn't hesitate. He went from vehicle to vehicle, assessing damage, pulling apart engines, replacing broken components with whatever scraps were available. He worked like a man possessed, improvising with wires, belts, and spare parts that were often not meant to go together. Every click of a wrench, every turn of a screwdriver became an act of precision and desperation. A shell exploded nearby, shaking the ground beneath him, sending dirt and debris into his eyes, but Arthur did not stop. Soldiers ducked and shouted, fearing for their lives, while he kept his hands on engines as if the chaos around him did not exist. He had learned that panic was contagious, and in this moment his calm became a shield for those around him. One truck refused to start. Its engine was completely destroyed, a tangled mess of metal and wires. Arthur studied it carefully, then began to strip components from another damaged vehicle nearby. Minutes stretched into hours as he pieced together a functioning engine from parts that had been considered useless. When he finally turned the ignition, the engine roared to life, and the soldiers erupted in cheers. "Sir, you've saved this convoy," one of the officers said, disbelief and gratitude mixed in his voice. Arthur simply nodded, wiping sweat and grime from his face. "Just doing my job," he said, though he knew the words didn't capture the weight of what had just happened. Every engine he rebuilt, every vehicle he saved meant lives spared. And yet, the danger never left him. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the consequences could be catastrophic. The following days were a blur of movement and repairs. Arthur became a constant presence on the front lines, moving from stranded tank to broken truck, always working, always calculating, always improvising. Soldiers began to depend on him not just for repairs, but for strategy. Where to position vehicles, how to keep them operational under fire, which engines could be cannibalized for parts. Arthur realized that his understanding of machinery had become intertwined with an understanding of human survival. He was no longer just a mechanic. He was a problem solver, a strategist of sorts, and a quiet guardian. He could see possibilities that others could not, paths to survival hidden in engines, gears, and wires. Yet, as he worked tirelessly, the toll began to show. Exhaustion weighed on him. Sleep became a fleeting luxury, and the line between day and night blurred into a continuous rhythm of danger and repair. He dreamed of engines, of gears meshing perfectly or failing catastrophically, of soldiers depending on him in moments of extreme fear. War had transformed his life in ways he never anticipated, but even amidst the exhaustion, a strange sense of purpose grew. For the first time in his life, Arthur felt that his skills truly mattered, that his hands could wield power over life and death, not through weapons, but through knowledge, precision, and determination. And yet, a shadow lingered. Every time he heard an explosion or felt a vehicle tremble under him, he knew how fragile their survival truly was. Each repair was temporary, each victory fleeting. War was not kind to those who relied on machines, nor to those who fixed them. And Arthur understood that the greatest challenges were still ahead, moments that would test not only his skill, but his courage and ingenuity beyond anything he had faced so far. The soldiers began to see him differently. No longer just the quiet mechanic, Arthur had become an essential part of their survival, a silent hero whose actions saved lives in ways guns never could. And for Arthur, that was enough, for now. It was a night that would etch itself into Arthur's memory forever. The moon was a thin crescent, barely illuminating the shattered landscape of the front line. Silence had fallen, heavy and unnatural, broken only by the distant thud of artillery and the occasional rustle of movement. Arthur, along with a small convoy, had been tasked with transporting vital communications equipment across a contested zone. Every inch of the terrain was mined with both explosives and the invisible danger of enemy patrols. Arthur knew the vehicles were old and battered. Every engine he had patched up over the past weeks was now being pushed to the limit. He climbed into the lead armored truck, checking gauges and making quick adjustments while the driver muttered under his breath about the curse of this mission. Arthur didn't reply. Words were useless when precision and vigilance were what kept them alive. Halfway through the journey, the ambush struck. A sudden hail of gunfire tore through the night, punctuated by the deafening roar of exploding shells. Tires shredded, engines stuttered, and soldiers ducked instinctively. The convoy descended into chaos with men yelling, engines smoking, and darkness concealing the true scale of the attack. Arthur reacted instantly. He leapt from the lead truck to a disabled vehicle whose engine had died mid-route. The cab was riddled with bullet holes, and a terrified soldier huddled inside, frozen. "We can't move it, sir," the soldier cried. Arthur ignored the panic. His hands worked like trained machines themselves, rewiring damaged circuits, reconnecting fuel lines, and improvising parts from nearby wreckage. Sparks flew as bullets ricocheted around him. Time stretched and compressed simultaneously. Minutes felt like hours. Every decision carried immense weight. Arthur's experience with engines became a lifeline. He restarted the truck just as another shell slammed into the ground a mere 10 meters away. The soldier inside looked at him with wide eyes, unable to comprehend how calm this man could remain amid such carnage. Arthur simply nodded, signaling him to drive, and jumped to the next vehicle. The ambush was relentless. Vehicles exploded, creating walls of fire and smoke. Soldiers fell, some injured, others paralyzed with fear. But Arthur moved from engine to engine, connecting batteries, replacing belts, and rewiring ignitions with an almost supernatural precision. With each engine he resurrected, more of the convoy could escape the encirclement. At one point, a heavy shell struck an old fuel truck that he had just repaired. Flames erupted instantly, and the heat singed his hair and clothes. Without hesitation, Arthur grabbed a fire extinguisher and rushed into the inferno, extinguishing the blaze and dragging the terrified driver to safety. He was scorched, battered, and breathing smoke, but he couldn't stop. Lives depended on him. By dawn, the ambush was over. Only half of the convoy had survived, but without Arthur's intervention, none would have made it. Soldiers looked at him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The commanders whispered about his miraculous work, though Arthur waved off their praise. "I just did what had to be done," he muttered, voice hoarse, eyes tired yet sharp. That night, in the quiet aftermath, Arthur wandered among the wreckage, counting the cost silently. Every destroyed vehicle was a reminder of the fragile line between survival and death. Every life saved was a testament to improvisation, skill, and calm under fire. Yet a gnawing worry lingered in the back of his mind. Next time, the ambush could be larger, more coordinated, and his abilities might not be enough. The soldiers began to understand something profound about him. Arthur wasn't just a mechanic. He was a problem solver, in the purest sense, a man who could navigate chaos with skill, courage, and an almost eerie calm. And though he insisted he was just doing his job, those who witnessed his actions knew better. This man was a guardian, a quiet hero whose expertise had saved more lives than anyone with a gun. As the sun rose, painting the battlefield in pale gold, Arthur allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The engines hummed in the distance, soldiers regrouped, and the war pressed on. But within that chaos, one thing was certain. As long as he had hands, tools, and determination, he could keep people alive, even if it meant standing alone against the fury of war. Yet, somewhere deep in his mind, a silent voice warned him. Every miracle had its limits, and soon Arthur would face a challenge that no skill, no courage, and no improvisation could entirely prepare him for. The days after the ambush passed in a blur of repairs, reports, and preparation for the next mission. Arthur's hands were sore, his clothes perpetually stained with grease and soot, but his mind remained sharp. Soldiers began to treat him with a mix of respect and quiet awe. To them he was more than a mechanic. He was a symbol that even in the darkest corners of war, skill and ingenuity could tip the balance between life and death. Then came the intelligence report that would define Arthur's next trial. The enemy had fortified a strategic supply point, and without taking it, Allied forces risked being cut off from reinforcements. The problem was simple to state, but nearly impossible to execute. The convoy needed to deliver supplies directly through an active battlefield where no one had survived more than a few hours under fire. Arthur volunteered to prepare the vehicles. "We'll need every ounce of speed, every engine firing perfectly," he told the commanders, who looked at him like he was insane. "This isn't a job for one man, Arthur. This is a death trap." But Arthur only nodded. Death traps were precisely where he felt he could make the difference. 4. The next 2 days, Arthur worked tirelessly. He tore apart engines, cannibalized old machinery, and rebuilt trucks that had been declared irreparable. He devised improvised armor plating, rerouted fuel lines to prevent fires, and tuned every vehicle to extract maximum performance under extreme stress. Soldiers watched, often afraid to speak, but learning to trust his judgment in ways they hadn't before. On the night of the mission, the convoy moved silently through the shattered landscape. The air was thick with tension, every shadow a potential threat. Arthur rode in the lead vehicle, constantly monitoring the engines, calling adjustments over the radio, and making split-second decisions to avoid mines and ambushes. The convoy became a living machine, its movements orchestrated by Arthur's meticulous attention to detail. Then came the first ambush. Enemy soldiers emerged from trenches and ruined buildings, firing with precision and intent to destroy. Explosions rocked the convoy, sending dust and debris into the night sky. Arthur leapt into action. One truck had its ignition shot out. He climbed on top, rewiring exposed wires under fire while bullets ricocheted around him. Another vehicle's brakes failed. Arthur improvised a manual override, guiding the driver through a maze of ruined streets and sudden craters. Hours passed in a haze of smoke, noise, and near-death experiences. Soldiers moved like shadows, trusting Arthur's directions implicitly. His knowledge of machinery, his calm under pressure, and his ability to improvise in ways that defied logic kept the convoy moving. At the final stretch, the convoy was cornered near a destroyed bridge. Enemy forces had anticipated the route, and escape seemed impossible. Arthur jumped from vehicle to vehicle, devising a last-minute solution. Using spare parts and materials from wrecked trucks, he constructed a makeshift ramp and reinforced a damaged truck chassis. One by one, the vehicles surged forward, crossing the ruined terrain as enemy fire tore the night apart. When the last truck cleared the danger zone, silence fell. Smoke lingered, fires smoldered, and soldiers stared at each other in disbelief. Many had expected death, but thanks to Arthur, nearly everyone had survived. He didn't smile or boast. He simply wiped soot from his hands and began checking the engines again. That night, Arthur understood something profound. Skill and courage could save lives, but they came with consequences. The physical and emotional toll was immense. Soldiers who had once treated him like just another mechanic now looked to him as a leader, a guardian, and deep down, Arthur knew that no amount of preparation could protect him from the ultimate challenge that loomed ahead, a test that would push him beyond the limits of engines, improvisation, and even courage. As dawn broke, he stood among the convoy, staring at the horizon. The war was far from over, and the battlefield would claim many more. But for now, one truth remained. In the chaos of destruction, he had become indispensable, and soon he would have to confront the moment when his hands and his mind might no longer be enough to save those who depended on him. The days following the convoy mission passed in a tense quiet. Arthur's hands ached from every wire soldered, every engine rebuilt under fire, but the exhaustion was not just physical. Each survivor's grateful glance reminded him that the battlefield demanded more than skill. It demanded constant vigilance, adaptability, and a courage that machines alone could not provide. A new assignment came, one that challenged Arthur in a way he had not anticipated. Intelligence indicated that an enemy artillery unit, hidden deep within a destroyed industrial zone, was systematically targeting Allied positions. The unit was mobile, well camouflaged, and heavily armed. Traditional reconnaissance had failed. A frontal assault would be suicidal. The task was simple to explain, impossible to execute: neutralize or disable the artillery without losing more soldiers. Arthur was summoned. "We need your expertise," the commander said, sliding a blueprint across the table. "We believe you can get close enough to rig the artillery, or at least disable it. No one else can." Arthur examined the schematic, recognizing the machinery from years of experience, and realized the challenge was unlike anything he had faced. It wasn't just about engines or vehicles. It was about improvisation, stealth, and understanding the enemy's mind. For 2 nights, he studied the zone, marking potential hazards, noting enemy patrol patterns, and designing improvised devices from the remnants of damaged vehicles. Soldiers prepared for a raid, but Arthur insisted on leading a small team through the wreckage, confident that subtlety would outweigh brute force. He became both strategist and engineer, blending technical knowledge with battlefield intuition. The night of the operation arrived. Fog rolled over the industrial ruins, masking movement, but hiding danger as well. Arthur led the team silently, whispering instructions, checking every device, and ensuring that each improvised mechanism functioned flawlessly. The enemy's artillery positions were alive with motion, spotters and gunners moving in calculated rhythm, unaware of the silent threat approaching. Arthur approached the first artillery piece, analyzing the gears and hydraulic systems. His fingers worked quickly, bypassing locks, rerouting power, and carefully planting small but effective sabotages. A misstep could alert the enemy and cost lives. Sweat dripped down his forehead, mingling with soot and grease, but his mind remained a machine, precise and calculating. Suddenly, a shadow shifted. A sentry, closer than anticipated, froze for a moment. Arthur's heart skipped, but his training took over. He signaled the team, a silent hand gesture, and everyone held their position. The sentry passed without noticing, unaware that death had brushed so close. One by one, the artillery units were neutralized. Engines locked, firing mechanisms jammed, power lines severed. Arthur's team moved with disciplined efficiency, every action choreographed to perfection. Still, the tension never lifted. One wrong move would be catastrophic. Hours later, as the first rays of dawn crept over the industrial wasteland, the team emerged from the ruins. No lives were lost. The artillery threat had been eliminated without a single shot fired. Arthur, covered in grime and exhaustion, looked at the survivors and understood the paradox. The battlefield rewarded violence, Yet he had won through intellect, skill, and courage. But the victory came at a cost. The strain on his body and mind was immense, the sleepless nights and adrenaline-fueled operations leaving him teetering on the edge of fatigue. Soldiers looked to him not just as a mechanic, but as a symbol of hope and ingenuity. Every mission, every improvisation increased the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Arthur realized something crucial that night. The war was no longer just about engines, vehicles, or mechanics. It was about decisions, timing, and judgment under pressure. Every life saved was a balance of skill and instinct. The battlefield had shifted, and the challenges ahead would demand more than he had ever given, testing his limits, his morality, and his very will to endure. As he finally rested for a few hours, Arthur's thoughts returned to the soldiers he had saved, the lives that depended on his hands, and the knowledge that every operation, no matter how small, carried immense consequences. The war was far from over, and he understood that soon he would face the ultimate trial, not of machinery, but of courage, strategy, and survival itself. The following days were a blur of missions, repairs, and improvisation. Arthur's hands bore the marks of war, cuts, burns, grease ingrained under fingernails, but it was his mind that felt the real weight. Every decision, every calculated move seemed to carry the lives of dozens. Soldiers no longer called him just the mechanic. They called him the Lifeline, a title Arthur accepted with quiet humility, though he felt the pressure grow heavier with each passing mission. Intelligence reports brought troubling news. A heavily fortified enemy command post had been located, controlling multiple artillery units and intercepting Allied movements. The challenge was unprecedented. It wasn't just a mission. It was a test of everything Arthur had learned, every skill honed through years of experience under fire. Failure would mean not just lost vehicles or equipment, but countless lives. Arthur studied the maps, the terrain, and every scrap of information the scouts could provide. He sketched diagrams on scraps of paper, planning routes, escape paths, and contingencies. The operation would require precision timing, technical expertise, and stealth like never before. For the first time, he felt doubt, not about his skill, but about whether any human could survive the complexity and danger of what lay ahead. Night fell, and the team assembled. Faces lit with determination masked the tension that gripped each soldier. Arthur felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the same sensation that had carried him through countless harrowing moments, but now magnified. They moved out, shadows against the moonlight, silent as ghosts, every step measured. As they approached the enemy command post, Arthur noticed the intricate network of defenses. Mines, tripwires, and automated sentries littered the path. Every obstacle required improvisation. With nimble hands, he disarmed traps, rerouted power systems, and created diversions that allowed the team to advance unnoticed. Each move was calculated, a balance between risk and reward. Inside the command post, chaos and precision collided. Arthur guided his team through corridors, disabling communication lines, sabotaging equipment, and ensuring that the enemy's ability to coordinate was crippled. At one point, a patrol nearly discovered their position. Arthur's heart raced, but he kept his composure, signaling his team to freeze and slip past like shadows. The stakes had never been higher. Hours passed like minutes. By dawn, the mission's success was evident. The enemy command post was inoperative, artillery units neutralized, and communication lines severed. The team emerged from the ruins, tired but victorious. Soldiers cheered quietly, understanding the magnitude of what had been achieved, while Arthur remained stoic, aware that victory in war was often fleeting. But amidst the relief, a sense of foreboding lingered. The enemy, though weakened, was not defeated. Arthur realized that war was not a series of isolated battles, but a continuous challenge, a test of endurance, ingenuity, and morality. Every life saved, every mission completed, carried consequences that extended far beyond the battlefield. As he watched the sunrise over the scarred landscape, Arthur understood the paradox of his existence. He had become a hero, without firing a shot, a savior through intellect and skill rather than brute force. Yet the battlefield had changed him. He was no longer the mechanic who repaired machines. He was a strategist, a protector, a lifeline. And the ultimate test, he knew, was yet to come. In the quiet moments before the next mission, Arthur reflected on the lives he had saved, the decisions that had weighed on him, and the unspoken truth among his comrades. The war was as much about human resilience, courage, and ingenuity as it was about weapons and tactics. And somewhere, beyond the horizon, awaited a challenge that would define not just his skill, but his very essence as a soldier, a human, and a guardian of life. The sun was barely rising when Arthur received orders for the next operation. The intelligence was clear. An enemy unit had set up a trap that threatened an entire battalion. There was no room for error. Unlike previous missions, this one was unpredictable. Every instinct Arthur had developed over months of chaos screamed that the risk was unprecedented. He prepared the equipment himself, inspecting engines, weapons, and vehicles down to the last bolt. Soldiers watched him, a mixture of trust and awe in their eyes. Arthur had become more than a mechanic. He was the anchor that held them together, the silent guide through danger. Yet in his chest, doubt lingered. Could skill alone overcome a trap set so deliberately, so cruelly? The convoy moved out. Streets that once seemed mundane now held 1,000 dangers. Debris, snipers, and concealed explosives. Arthur took the lead, maneuvering vehicles with precision born of years working with engines and mapping routes. Every turn, every detour was calculated to minimize exposure. He wasn't just guiding machines, he was guiding lives. Suddenly, the ambush came. Explosions rocked the convoy, sending dust and smoke into the air. Soldiers yelled, scrambling for cover. Arthur's heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He directed the drivers through a maze of rubble, rerouted paths, and even improvised repairs on vehicles damaged in real time. One tank stalled just meters from an enemy firing line. Arthur leaped into action, fixing the engine with bare hands while under fire. Time seemed to stretch. Every second mattered. Every decision had consequences. Soldiers followed his cues without hesitation, trusting him to lead them out alive. Arthur's mind worked faster than ever, analyzing the situation, predicting enemy moves, and calculating routes of escape. He realized, with a heavy clarity, that this mission was not just about strategy. It was about survival, about proving that intellect, courage, and calm under pressure could save more than brute force ever could. As the convoy broke through the last checkpoint, silence fell. The battalion had survived intact, no lives lost. Exhaustion swept over the soldiers, but there was also a sense of awe. Arthur stood amidst the chaos, dirt and blood on his hands and face, but his eyes clear. He had done what few could. He had turned machinery and knowledge into salvation. Later, in the makeshift command tent, officers offered praise, medals, and recognition. But Arthur refused accolades. He understood something profound. Victory was fleeting, recognition temporary. What mattered were the lives saved, the decisions made under impossible pressure, and the bond formed with those who had trusted him implicitly. As night fell, Arthur walked through the camp, reflecting on the journey. From a mechanic in a quiet town to the lifeline of soldiers in a war zone, he had been tested in ways no civilian could imagine. He thought of the men who had laughed at his nerdy obsession with engines, now calling him a hero. He thought of every moment of doubt, every risk, every failure narrowly avoided. And he realized the truth that war had taught him. Heroism is not always about bravery in the moment. It is about quiet competence, calm under fire, and the relentless will to keep others alive. And yet, even in this triumph, a shadow of uncertainty remained. Arthur knew the world beyond the battlefield was different, unpredictable, and waiting for him to make choices that could echo as powerfully as any mission he had led. The war had ended for the battalion, but the war within, the war to define his identity, his purpose, and his humanity, was far from over. He looked at the horizon, engines idling softly in the background, and whispered to himself, "I just did my job." But deep down, he knew that the truth was more complex. His job had been more than repair and maintenance. It had been the difference between life and death, chaos and survival. And now the real question loomed. Could the skills, the calm, and the courage forged in war carry him safely through a world that demanded a different kind of battle? One not fought with machinery, but with choices, trust, and the weight of memory. Arthur had survived war. He had saved lives. He had become legend in the eyes of those who followed him. But as he walked into the darkness, the faint rumble of engines fading behind him, one thought remained. The greatest battles are never the ones fought on the battlefield. They are the ones fought within, and their outcomes are never guaranteed.